turn to James chapter 5. I think we had focused quite a bit on that first paragraph of James chapter 5 on James' warning to the rich people. Most likely, directly, rich people within the congregation, but of course, the spiritual principles would apply to all rich people, though those who would not be Christians wouldn't care about this warning at all. That's how that goes. Um, and notice that they're to weep and wail because of the misery that's coming on you. People who are rich don't think about the misery that's coming upon them. The irony of it is, if you think about this throughout human history, often the gathering of wealth is with the design thinking about protecting themselves from the misery of life. And that's what they want a lot of comfort, protection from what life dishes out. But wealth doesn't do that. In fact, if you read through the Proverbs, it's fascinating that you get the clear picture, at least as all the Proverbs collected about wealth. You get the strong impression that what's trying to be said in Proverbs is the more wealth you have, the more problems you're going to have. And people who have a lot of money don't like to hear that. But this is what he is saying. They're just not aware of the consequences. Your wealth has rotted. Moths have eaten your clothes. We talked about that. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. These are strong words of judgment against possessing wealth, not thinking about others with what you have. You've hoarded your wealth in the last days. It is fascinating that in the Old and in the New Testament, there are warnings against hoarding your wealth. Now, my question is, why does that make a difference? Because in both the Old Testament, New Testament, there's strong warnings about that, hoarding your wealth. Maybe we need to back up and ask a prior question, though. How do you know if you're hoarding your wealth? That's an important question. Have you ever thought about that? How do you know if you're hoarding your wealth?
You spend it on yourself and not try to help the needy and the poor and just keeping all of that money for like the rich man that was going to build.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Going to build a bigger barn.
Yeah, you know how God took care of him.
He said, well, pretty foolish approach, because tonight your soul's going to be required of you, Jesus said in that parable. Yeah, that's important to think about what we do with what the Lord has gifted us. I was thinking in Ephesians, it's interesting that Paul, there's a section, I think it's in Ephesians 4, where he talks about how that when you become a Christian and you put on the new man and put off the old, he has a whole string of what we would call Christian ethics. And one of the things he says that's interesting, if you used to steal no more, and find work with your hands so that you may be able to give to those that are needy. So that when you have the ability as a Christian to make money and to profit, the Christian ethic thinks beyond just caring for yourself. What Jesus wants, and James is advocating here, is if you have wealth, probably one of the first things you need to think about is, in the sight of God, God, thank you for gifting me this. How can I use it to help others? And that's a question that really every Christian needs to ask. You've given me this, so how can I use it to help others? And he's warning against this because they've hoarded wealth in their last days. Now that's a fascinating phrase, because they don't know that it's their last days. And this has both, I think, a double reference to maybe the end of their own life, but that phrase "in the last days" can also be what we call eschatological, or it's looking toward the end times. Those last days are coming, and you're going to be held accountable for how you use your wealth. Well, look at verse 4, because we mentioned this. This is the practical problem. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. So where did some of their wealth come from? Not paying them and pocketing that money. Yes. So people who are, farmers and own the land, he wants them to know that they are responsible for how they treat their workers. And that's an amazing thing. We have all through the New Testament places that give us insight into God's desire for how the Christians should work in the public arena. And if you're in the workplace, how do you treat others? Because what's fascinating is so much of the New Testament instruction is about how to treat each other in the church. There's a lot of challenges within the body of Christ, but at the same time, the Christian has responsibility in the marketplace. And if you're an owner, and here it's a farmer that owns land, and you got people working for you, you're going to be held accountable if you don't pay them right. If you keep back their pay and you stuff your own pockets with what should have gone to them. Now, here's what's interesting. What is the response of these workers? What does it say that they did? They cry out. Now, what do you think that means? For the workers to cry out, what can that mean? But this crying out is a phrase that can refer to what you're talking about, the suffering and immediate misery of poverty, but also crying out against the injustice. This shouldn't be happening. And maybe they cried out to, the farmer, but certainly it's cries that reach the ears of God Almighty. And I get the impression it includes prayers of agony, crying out to the Lord for help. And notice the phrase, this is kind of cool. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. Do you think God cares about people in the agony of life? Does God care about people when they're being abused and misused? One of the things that struck me one time, I read from a Christian writer that they made this comment. You know you're on the right path when the things that hurt the heart of God hurt your heart too. So think about if people are being abused, misused, defrauded in this case, causing suffering and all kinds of things. If God cares about that, we should care about that kind of stuff too. And so there's wonderful questions that come up in your own heart as a Christian. When I see human suffering, can I help to alleviate it? When I see people mistreated, can I step forward to advocate for them? When people are being abused, should I call it out? See, it's these kind of Christian personal responsibilities that you have within the workplace. Because that kind of stuff, God notices, and so should we. Boy, look at this. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. So they're living the good life, we would say. But here's what they don't know. And this imagery cracks me up. You have fattened yourselves on the day of slaughter. It's like a cow being fattened up. And the cow is eating all this grain and all this grass and having a hunky-dory life, doesn't realize that the day of slaughter is coming. I mean, this just blows my mind for an image. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one. Yeah, that's what you were saying, Nancy, who was not opposing you. So in other words, you got people that want to work, and they weren't causing the farmer that owned the land any problems. The problem was the owner was taking advantage of the workers and harvesters in a way they never should. Now, here's something else that's interesting, and you know this from back in that time. Many of these harvesters would have been hired by the day. And Jesus even tells a parable, where all the workers were in the middle of town. And one guy, you remember, he gets hired the last hour of the day, and he gets paid the same as the rest of the workers all day. And it's interesting how Jesus deals with that. But that was very typical. You were a day laborer. you went into the center of town, and often the farmer would come and say, I want you, you, and you. And you would work, and then you get paid at the end of the day. So if your wages were being defrauded, and these owners of the farms were pocketing your money, who knows? You may have only gone home with half of what you hoped you'd work for to provide for your family. So it wasn't a good picture. So this is a warning to the rich. Now, in the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and in Jesus' teachings in the Gospels and here in James, there is a lot of teaching on how to handle material possessions and money. A lot of teaching on it. And it's fascinating because you think about how central money issues are to our daily life. You just can't get away from money issues, Keith. And I find it amazing that so much of the Bible does touch on money matters. And so we could say that it matters how we handle our money. And this is part of that teaching. Any comments or questions on this section of his warning against those who are rich and who are oppressing other people and taking advantage of them? But it is interesting, no matter which side of the equation that you're on.
But still, I mean, if you have just a small amount, you're responsible
still
for how you use that small amount of money.
Here's what's interesting in this paragraph. There's two dimensions of stewardship that come together in this paragraph. One is what you're talking about, Agnes, is no matter what you got, how are you going to manage it and to honor the Lord? And then the other is a stewardship of being a business leader and a stewardship of relationships. How do you treat people that work for you? How do you treat people when you know decisions that you're going to make impact them? And so I don't remember growing up ever hearing a sermon on this, but it's clear to me that in the New Testament, there is a strong teaching on stewardship of relationships. How do you treat the people that God has given you in your life? That's a huge question. Sometimes we end up having to say, well, I need to do a lot better. And we may think about even money. If you get to the point where you're not as frugal with your money as you ought to be, and you get a little flippant with your money, sometimes you get in financial trouble. But think with relationships. What if you're not careful and honoring of the relationships that God puts in your life? What's going to happen? So it's interesting how those two dimensions of stewardship kind of come together in this paragraph. Okay, verse 7. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. Now, this is fascinating because all of a sudden he's going to shift his discussion to a lifestyle of patience and how that's supposed to help us as we think about the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and the spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm because the Lord's coming is near. Do we allow the reality of the Lord's coming to help us to be patient and stand firm? Or maybe we don't think about it enough. The Lord's coming. One of the phrases in the New Testament, several places, is that the Lord is near. There's from early Christian preaching, there is an expectation that the Lord's coming is right around the corner, and they'll say the Lord is near. And because of that, there's 2 or 3 things that follow from it. Number one is because the Lord's coming is near, you need to be careful how you live, because you don't want the Lord catch you like a thief in the night and you not being prepared for that. The other is that with the idea of the Lord being near, that's supposed to think of it like this: to keep your heart steady and firm, realizing that nothing in this world really should ruffle you or turn your life upside down, because this world isn't the end of it all. We're expecting the coming of the Lord. And James is going to use this to say, be patient and stand firm. I'm wondering, as he said that, how the patience would need to be lived out in the congregation with all these things that we've covered. Have you ever noticed how impatience can get you into trouble? Think about things that we get into trouble because we've been impatient. Whether it's a word that you said you shouldn't have done, or something you did real quick that you shouldn't have, and the results didn't turn out good. Impatience can be a real bear, and it can cause problems. And he says this here because you're assuming that it was showing up in the life of the congregation in specific ways. Paul uses it a lot. This idea of standing firm is a neat, it's really a neat metaphor, because sometimes it was used to talk about foundations that were laid, or you prepared the ground for a foundation so it wouldn't crack on you, or it wouldn't lean or whatever. But to stand firm. When you hear both Paul and James say stand firm, what does that mean to you? How do you know you're standing firm? Think of all the things that could cause people either to lose their faith or it weaken their faith. Both of those. And to stand firm, think about how this would have an immediate application here. What about these harvesters that were crying out and being defrauded? Well, be patient, stand firm. And I could hear them thinking, I could see them thinking, okay, so these farmers that are defrauding us and keeping back our pay and they're getting rich, this is not the end of the story. James is asking us, be patient, stand firm. The Lord's coming. Payday someday for them, even though they're taking our pay. So just the whole picture of standing firm. And then he gets into some other things like don't grumble against one another. Do you remember the long list? And I think I copied it. I have it at home on my computer now. But remember, we went through all of the passages in the New Testament on one another and talked about how that the Christian faith really is a one another. Some of those one another's are negative. Like, here's something you don't do to one another. Well, here's one of those. Don't grumble against one another. Why is that so important that James needs to put it in here? You think, well, what's that got to do with religion? Why is that so important? Don't grumble against one another. So don't grumble against each other. Boy, what happens in the church if members start grumbling against each other? Oh, is it a problem? See, this word grumbling implies a couple things. When you start grumbling, you start gossiping. The two go together, unfortunately. When you start grumbling, you lose your ability to encourage. A grumbler is never an encourager. You ever notice that? A grumbler will not encourage. So even in the grumbler, there might be something good. Yeah. Well, that's why he's calling these Christians to accountability, because and again, we have to assume he doesn't give us details, but there's enough grumbling going on in the congregation. It's affecting the what I might call the morale of the fellowship. When you get a congregation full of grumblers, and I've heard of situations where people will go home from church on Sunday and say they felt like they were worse off for having gone to church because so much grumbling and griping and complaining, it just sort of lay like a heavy cloud over the assembly. Like, that's not what the Lord wants. This is let's turn over 1 Corinthians 10. This is such a, I guess over the years, it's dawned on me how much Lord doesn't want me to be a grumbler. Not that I always succeed, because Nancy can tell you I blow it sometimes. But 1 Corinthians 10, listen to how important this is. You've got Paul giving a warning from Israel's history. He goes into quite a bit of detail. But let me start at verse 6. He talked about these things occurred and he's referring to Israel as an example. These things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things like they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. Grumblers were killed by the destroying angel. This is a huge issue. And I suspect, and maybe I'm happy to confess on my part, I don't think through the years I've taken the aspect of grumbling as seriously as I should. I've always called it a gripe factor. Guys like to gripe about things and grumble. But how helpful is that? Not very helpful, is it? Yeah. It's a serious thing. When you're in the mode of grumbling, I doubt you're thinking about God very much. Usually you're thinking only about yourself. And that's why it's a huge issue. More than we've ever let on. This may be where we're really challenged. Think about, okay, Lord, I'm getting ready to grumble here. Please help me not to. But just be aware of how critical of an issue this is for Christian living. And sometimes I think we forget, don't we? Spiritually, we have to get to the place where we're enough self-aware that with God's help, we can do a little bit of healthy self-talk. Now, you're getting ready to gripe and grumble. Don't do it. It's not going to honor God. Here's why this is kind of cool. In the Psalms, if you've ever noticed this, David over and over and over, he'll say, "Oh, my soul." And a lot of people think that expression is the Hebrew expression of people in the Old Testament, as David has in the Psalm. It's how you would kind of talk to yourself. "Oh, my soul." And boy, I'm telling you, there's a lot of places in the Psalms where David's talking to "Oh, my soul," and he's trying to get things together and right. And you ought to read through them. All those places says, "Oh, my soul." You can see he's struggling to make sure he thinks the right way and he does the right thing. So this is good and helpful. Don't grumble against one another, or you will be judged. See, it's not just the fact that it's not good to do and it dishonors God, but you'll be judged. I'm like, seriously? So throughout the letter of James, you're going to find several places where there's strong language of accountability. And this is one of them. The judge is standing at the door. When we talk about God being judge, there are a lot of Christian people today that refuse to think about God as judge. Why is that? Why do people not like to think of this aspect of God's character? God is judge. He's standing at the door. They don't want to feel guilty, so don't talk to me about God being judge because I've already made up my mind how I want to live. And it also kind of goes counter against their view of God where, well, God is all loving. And I heard one person recently say, all that God wants is for me to be happy. I'm like, what Bible verse did that come from? All that God wants is for me to be happy and that's it? You got to be kidding me. That's no accountability in that expression, is it? So in the letter here, and of course, you can see he's hoping that these farmers that are defrauding the harvesters, they need to wake up and smell the coffee. God is judge. You're going to be accountable. And also the grumblers in the congregation, wake up and smell the coffee. You're going to be held accountable for this. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering. So it's interesting how he'll talk about patience, and now he's going to shift a little bit to talk about patience in the face of suffering. So you talk about a real human problem. This is it, isn't it? Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. So he's inviting them to think about the prophets. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. And you've heard of Job's patience or perseverance. And you've heard and seen what the Lord finally brought about. So the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. He gives two examples. The first is he just says, take the prophets. So what lesson can you get from remembering the prophets if you're going to think about patience in the face of suffering? He just says, take the prophets. So what do you remember from the prophets that helps with that? How were the prophets treated? If you go back and read all the prophets and how they were treated by the leaders and by a lot of people in general, I've often said it's fascinating to me. You don't find any occasion in the Old Testament where God said through one of the prophets, okay, the doors are open for the prophetic office. Everyone that wants to be a prophet, line up with your resume. Well, no, every prophet was called by God, and many of the prophets weren't all that happy. They were reluctant. Yeah. Jeremiah is often called the reluctant prophet. Well, so Isaiah was too. If you go through, many of the prophets were reluctant to take on that role because they knew how they were treated. The prophetic role, and when I say this, you'll get it in a heartbeat. In the Old Testament, the prophetic role was speaking to the elephant in the room. And when I say speaking to the elephant in the room, what does that mean?
Everybody knows about it, but
everybody knows what's going on, but everybody accepts that we don't want anybody to talk about it. Well, the prophet would talk about it. And because the prophet talked about it, they made the prophet suffer because they didn't like to hear what the prophet said. So he says, take the prophets. Wow. Okay. I think back, boy, they didn't go through a lot of suffering. But what's also implied, how did they make it through that suffering? It's amazing to read how the prophets learned to lean on God during their tenure of prophecy. They really had to lean on God, and they knew that. The NIV says perseverance. And I think that's the better translation because in parts of the book of Job, if you read the story, there are places where he almost loses it. Okay. With the kind of suffering he went through, you really feel sorry for him. And so if you take the King James Version translation patience and you take that to mean like kind of what we think about when we use the word patience, like, well, he just kind of took it all and didn't say a word, and he was real patient and just kind of rolled with what happened. No, that's not Job. Now, what Job learned, it's fascinating. At the end, well, there's two things about Job that are so critical. I think it's 5 times in the book of Job. And I think it's the only place in the Old Testament where a person is described this way. 5 times in the book of Job, it uses the word integrity to describe him. So that no matter what he went through, he was going to stay faithful to God. And that's faithful integrity. It's amazing. Now, at the end of the story, Job realizes he's complained to God too much. And at the end, he goes, uh-oh, I need to put my hand over my mouth. I spoke too quickly. Because God comes along and says, okay, Job, you think you know everything. Where were you when I did such and such? Where were you when I did? And he goes, uh-oh. He realizes. But that's a good question because, and that's where often, if you're not careful, a translation can lend itself to almost a misunderstanding of the text. It's really the perseverance of Job, particularly because in the book, that idea of integrity comes up at real crucial points. And that's right. You can go through all kinds of suffering And if you think of Job, no matter what the suffering, you persevered. Remember, we ran across the phrase earlier, stand firm. That's what Job did. When he faced suffering in all of its different dimensions, remember what his wife said? Here, she had the answer. Why don't you just curse God and die? I can see Job going, what? No way. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Oh, it's past time. Thank you all for being here for Bible class. Hopefully it's been interesting and helpful.